Welcome, everyone and anyone, to this presentation on Factorial ANOVA. Presentation is going to concentrate on conceptual issues in Factorial ANOVA so that class time can be spent in data analyses. So a factorial design is one in which there are multiple independent levels and multiple levels of the independent variables, and those are being used to yield interpretations about effects on a single continuously measured dependent variable. For a factorial ANOVA, the independent variables are categorical or at most ordinal, and you can have more than two independent variables. It becomes more complicated to analyze and interpret more than two independent variables in a factorial ANOVA, but it is often done usually with not more than three. You get both conceptual difficulties in interpretation and the need for very large sample sizes. And since these are usually associated with experimentation or quasi-experimentation, getting that many people to participate is challenging. So you usually see these with two or at the most three independent variables. So what we have an example of here that we're going to be looking at multiple times in this presentation is when you have two independent variables. We're calling them factors. One of them is source of feedback, and one of them is time of the feedback. So factor B is feedback source. There are three groups for factor B: self, peer, and teacher. And factor A is the time of the feedback, which can be immediate or delayed. So you see that there are 6 unique cells, and we call them cells. And we talk about the cell size, the number of cases that are within a cell. So a person might be in A1B1, which means that they would be in the delayed condition of self-feedback. So they'd be asked to give feedback to themselves, say a week after completing a task. Or a person could be in A2, B3, which means that they would get feedback from the teacher immediately upon performing a task, and so on. If we had the same number of people in each cell, that would be called a fully balanced design. So fully crossed, fully balanced is fully crossed is when all levels of one variable occur in combination with all levels of the other variable. So for instance, in this case, you don't have anyone who is getting teacher feedback, but only in the immediate condition. There's no case where a cell is empty or does not occur in the analysis. And as I said, a fully balanced design is one in which the number of people in each cell is equal. This is the case. We have two independent factors, and we can describe that since actually feedback time is our factor A, and it has 2 levels, and factor B is feedback source, and it has 3 levels. We'd call that a 2x3 design, where the first number represents the number of conditions in the first independent variable, and the second number represents the number of conditions in the second factor. There's no particular reason why one of these is factor A and one of them is factor B. It could be reversed. It's just the way I put it here. So in a matrix layout, the groups of variable A are usually shown in rows, and the groups of variable B is shown in columns. Again, it's arbitrary which you call A and which you call B. So the rows are A, the columns are B, and there is a term called the interaction, which is AB, which we will cover at greater length in a little bit. So what the ANOVA does is it partitions variance. And what you've seen in one-way ANOVA is that variance, the total amount of variance, and you practice this by hand and in SPSS, was divided into two sources. That was the variance between groups, the variance that was attributable to between group differences, and the variance that was attributable to random error. And you also partition variance in Factorial ANOVA, works by exactly the same principles, but because you have more possible sources of variance, you have more parts. And those parts derive from sum of squares. And so the variance estimates are the same as before. They're the sums of their squares divided by their degrees of freedom. So it's still all based on sums of squares, which are all based on deviations from various kinds of means. It's just there's more of them. So when we talk about the sums of squares that are attributable to between group differences, in one-way ANOVA, your sum of squares between, in Factorial ANOVA, we will have a between group difference for each factor. And so we now have to talk about main effects of separate factor. And so in our example, that could be the differences of the of time in terms of the mean for immediate feedback versus the mean for delayed feedback overall, and its overall tendency to relate to verbal expression. Or you could be looking at the main effect of feedback source, which would be overall irrelevant of time, the effect of self-feedback versus peer feedback versus teacher feedback. And those are called main effects. It's the effect of feedback source regardless of time, or the effect of time regardless of feedback source. Then the other way that sums of squares, that deviations are partitioned, is into the interaction effect. So the interaction effect is the overall effect of all of the mean differences. So not just mean differences within a comparisons between rows versus comparisons between columns, but the combinations of those. So an interaction, which we'll look at a little bit more, is when you're using information from both rows and columns to understand effects of rows and columns simultaneously on the dependent variable. And then there is always an error term, which once you get into Factorial ANOVA is usually called sum of squares error, as opposed to sum of squares within. So pretty much moving to what I just said, a Factorial ANOVA results in tests of multiple effects. Say that you have two independent variables, you have tests of two main effects, and you have a test of the interaction effect. So with the one-way ANOVA, your omnibus test is everything that it could be, because you only have one variable to be tested. But in Factorial ANOVA, you have tests of each main effect plus test of one, or even you can have, if you have more than two independent variables, you can have multiple interactions. So in this case, the test of the interaction would answer the question, does the effect of feedback source on verbal expression vary according to time or according to when the feedback is given? The way of putting that is the opposite way. Does the effect of the time the feedback is given on verbal expression vary according to the source of the feedback? So a little bit more about the interaction. Interactions are interesting. People used to kind of not like interactions because they complicate things. In more contemporary research, those complications are often actually an area of great interest. Because their downside is that they limit generalizability. If there's no interaction between time and feedback source, and only the main effect of time is statistically significant, then what you can say is, hey, as long as we give immediate feedback, it doesn't even matter who's giving it. What matters is that it's immediate. Whereas, or the other way, it doesn't matter whether the teacher delays feedback or gives it immediately. The teacher feedback always does the best. Then it's easier to create an intervention that's just going to encourage people or help people deliver immediate feedback, or help teachers develop good feedback and don't even bother with peer and self-feedback. But that's maybe not really that often the case, that there are no interactions. And so if you want to make good interventions, you often have to look at multiple sources of effects on the dependent variable and design your interventions in the light of those multiple sources. So they're harder to interpret, but they can make for more sensitive methods of educational development. Okay, so a significant interaction, and I'm repeating myself a little bit, means that the effects of one independent variable differ according to the levels of the other independent variable. So I'm just going to describe this setup with immediate versus delayed and source in a little bit more detail. Verbal expression, writing performance, I've put in two slightly, we'll call it writing performance from now on. So what we have is we have, this is a little bit, sorry, incomplete. We only have in this description, I'm sorry, the self-feedback. So in the two conditions, in the two timing conditions, one, you have feedback right in the next class period after a writing performance, two, in 1 week after a writing performance. All right, let me start that over again. Students do a writing performance. Then they are divided into 6 randomly assigned groups. Some of them are assigned to immediate self-feedback, which is immediately after the writing performance. They analyze their work in comparison to a rubric and make a plan for their next performance. Some students are assigned to peer feedback immediately, which means that immediately after completing their work, they work with a peer to analyze their performance, and perhaps rate it would be in both conditions. The conditions are similar, except it's the source of feedback. Some students are assigned to a delayed condition, which is a delay of 1 week before they either analyze their own work with a peer to analyze the work, or have an analysis from the teacher. So that's our setup for this study. And what we're going to look at is what it looks like if you have this interaction. So here you see a case with these variables where we have an interaction effect. So like what you look on a plot, a means plot, is immediately to see, well, first of all, you will have looked at your output and seen, I have a statistically significant interaction. So then you would have gone on to this means plot. When you go on to the means plot, what you're going to see is, if it's a really clear interaction, a crossed line. So the crossed line means that within a group, there is a different pattern of contrast related to membership in the other group. So to look at this in a way that hopefully will be a little bit more clear, it doesn't look like the action of the interaction is happening for, this is the peer group. Okay, so the peer group is blue, and it doesn't seem to matter on their future performance on writing, whether they're getting immediate or delayed. In fact, their performance is low. And these were all randomly assigned, so we assume that their overall performance is equivalent to the other students, but their future writing is, as long as they're in the peer condition, is pretty stable, whether it's immediate or delayed. So source of feedback is stable when feedback is provided by peers, regardless of time. So we're just going to ignore this. It might be interesting to look at the contrast between, say, teacher feedback and time feedback, and time in the immediate condition, and we can do that later, but we don't want to deal with it now. So what we want to look at, probably most descriptively, for descriptive purposes, and to understand the interaction, is this cross between the teacher and the self as a source of feedback. So what this is telling us is that when feedback is immediate, the effect on writing performance is pretty low for students who are giving themselves feedback, or their writing performance is low, relatively. Whereas their writing performance is relatively high when they've had a week to think about, presumably to think about the work before they give themselves feedback. On the other hand, on the other hand is what's important. On the other hand, when teachers give immediate feedback, the writing performance score is relatively high compared to other conditions. However, when their feedback is delayed, that effect is no longer found. And in fact, it's by comparison the self who has a higher, is associated with a higher writing performance. So then the effect of source is contingent on time, or the effect of time is contingent on source. If you're looking for the qualities that are most associated with high writing performance, that would be immediate teacher or delayed self. You need to know two things, time and source, in order to make an interpretation. Now, what I just said is looking at the chart, looking at the means plot. I'm sorry, it's not really a chart. Looking at the means plot. It's a purely descriptive interpretation. It does not involve any post hoc tests. And we'll go into that in class. Else, so with these interactions, it is not technically necessary that the lines cross. The lines can take different shapes. The fact that this line given here is so very flat compared to these other lines that are in angle could indicate an interaction. It really depends on the magnitude of these differences and the magnitude of the slope of at least one, because let's assume that you didn't have the red line, the teacher line, what you'd be looking at with the interaction is, let me see if I can get my annotation back on, is really the difference between this difference and this. And so you can't really read it very easily off a graphic, whereas even the cross lines may not be significant, but they'll be more apparent. And you're really only going to do this after you've already found a statistically significant interaction. So those are kind of the big conceptual issues in Factorial ANOVA. And we will go on either in class or in an additional video to the breakdown of how Factorial ANOVAs are calculated, but not during this recording. Thank you.